I'm worried that I'm going to be put out in the street. I'm worried that I love my home. I love my neighbors. Every penny I have, this was my nest egg.
A disabled veteran says he did everything right. He called, he asked for a deadline, he paid what he thought would save his home, and still, his nest egg was gone before the date he was told even arrived. This isn't a story about a massive debt or a years-long court fight. It's a story about how a small tax balance can trigger a system so fast that, by the time you realize what's happening, the decision is already stamped, sealed, and moving toward eviction. And what's making people furious isn't just the number attached to it, it's the contradiction at the center of it. Jim Borner says he was told he had until June 30th to make things right, but records show the sale happened June 20th. 10 days. That gap is where everything collapses. Trust, stability, and the belief that one phone call can protect you. Because if the timeline you're given doesn't match the timeline the system is actually using, then what chance does anyone have, especially someone dealing with disability, paperwork, and limited resources? And once the home changes hands, the story stops being about taxes and starts being about survival. From a reporter's standpoint, the first thing to understand is why this mobile home mattered so much to Jim Borner. This wasn't a second home, a rental, or some investment sitting on a spreadsheet. He describes it as the only thing he owned. The one place he could close the door and feel secure, the nest egg he had managed to hold on to while living with a disability that reshaped his everyday life. In his telling, the home represented stability in a world that had already taken a lot from him. And that's why the emotion in his voice isn't dramatic for the camera. It's panic. He's talking about not knowing where he'll be in a week. When someone says that, you're not hearing a financial complaint. You're hearing a person staring at displacement. That's what makes this case spread fast. People recognize the fear of losing the one thing keeping them grounded. Because once that anchor is gone, everything becomes uncertain at once. Health, safety, dignity, and the ability to even plan tomorrow. And then comes the detail that turns sympathy into outrage. The original amount at the center of the entire collapse. At the heart of this case is a number so small it almost sounds unreal in the context of what followed. $221. That's the unpaid tax balance described as the starting point of the chain reaction. And here's what makes this story so unsettling. Systems like tax enforcement don't measure the emotional weight of a home. They measure status, paid or unpaid, current or delinquent, eligible or not eligible, processed or not processed. When the process moves forward, it doesn't ask if the homeowner is vulnerable, confused, or relying on one last paycheck to clear the balance. It follows the next step on the list. That's why these cases often shock the public. A tiny debt becomes a massive consequence, and the speed of it feels disproportionate. But inside the system, it's not disproportionate. It's simply procedural. Jim's supporters see it as predatory. The officials reviewing the file point to rules. And Jim, stuck in the middle, sees it as a trap, because he says he wasn't ignoring the bill. He tried to handle it the responsible way. He called, he asked what to do, he sought clarity, and that leads us straight to the moment where everything hinges on one conversation and one deadline. Here's the detail that makes this case feel like a slow-motion disaster. Jim calls the county customer service line on June 13th, trying to confirm exactly what he owes and when he has to pay. That's what you're supposed to do when you're scared and trying not to make a mistake. According to records referenced in the story, he's told more than once that his deadline is June 30th. And that matters because timelines are everything in these cases. If you're facing any kind of forced sale process, you plan your entire survival around the date you're given. When you'll get money, when you'll pay, when you'll show up in person if you have to. During that call, Jim also asks the question any homeowner would ask, can they remove me before that deadline? And he says the answer he got suggested that wouldn't happen. So he leaves the call believing he has a clear runway to fix this. That's what makes the next step so heartbreaking, because he does pay. He submits money thinking he's protecting his home. He believes he met the deadline that was communicated. But what he didn't know is that the clock he was watching wasn't the clock the system was using. And the twist lands hard. This is the moment the story stops being confusing and starts feeling brutal. The sale reportedly happens June 20th, 10 days before the June 30th deadline Jim says he was given. Think about the psychological impact of that. If you believe you have time, you move like someone with time. You're gathering funds, arranging help, making calls, maybe waiting on a deposit, maybe dealing with medical limitations that slow everything down. But if the sale is already completed, then your actions become meaningless. Not because you didn't try, but because the finish line was moved without you knowing. Jim makes a payment believing it would keep him safe, but the payment comes after the sale has already occurred. From his perspective, that's not late, it's betrayal, because he says he relied on information given directly by the people in charge. And once a property is sold, the story changes instantly. It's no longer a question of catching up on a bill. It becomes a question of undoing a completed transaction, which is dramatically harder, slower, and often requires legal intervention. Jim only realizes what's happened after the fact, and the emotional fallout becomes public. He shows up, tells his story, and suddenly officials are forced to respond. But the next layer makes the situation even messier. Jim thought he had legal protection because of his disability. Jim's understanding was that his disability status offered some protection, an exemption or safeguard that would prevent a disaster like this. And on a human level, it makes sense why he believed that. If you're legally disabled and navigating government systems, you assume the policies designed for disabled residents will actually shield you, especially when the stakes are literally your housing. But officials later indicate a key issue. They say Jim did not fully complete the application process required for the disabled property tax exemption. That's the kind of detail that sounds small until you realize it's the difference between protected and unprotected in a system that runs on paperwork, not personal stories. This is where people get stuck in real life, because I qualify and I'm enrolled are not the same thing. A missing step, a delayed document, or a misunderstanding about what applied really means can leave someone exposed without realizing it. And in this case, that gap is devastating, because it becomes part of the official explanation for why the system continued forward. To Jim, it feels like the rules failed him. To the system, it looks like the requirements weren't completed. But then something unusual happens. A high-level county official appears to take Jim's situation seriously enough to intervene. When cases like this reach public attention, you often see officials respond with carefully worded statements and little else. But here the county treasurer, Royce Flora, takes a step that signals real concern. He sends communication to the sheriff's office indicating that Jim's intent to pay was clear and asking that the sale be reversed. That matters because it's not just sympathy. It's a request to unwind the outcome. Even more, he reportedly asks for additional mobile home sales to be pulled from an upcoming round while he investigates, citing concerns that suggest potential problems in how certain mobile home cases were being handled. In plain terms, it looks like the treasurer is saying, "Slow this down, something about this doesn't feel right." For viewers, that reads like validation, like finally someone inside the system sees what the public sees, that a homeowner was told one deadline and lost the home before it. But the real-world question is whether concern translates into power, because in government processes, authority is often split between offices, each with strict limits. And that's exactly what plays out next. The response becomes a partial concession that helps future cases more than it helps Jim. The sheriff's office responds in a way that sounds meaningful on paper. They confirm they've canceled an upcoming mobile home sale scheduled for July 18th, and they signal openness to further discussion. That's an administrative step that suggests the treasurer's concerns were heard. But here's the critical distinction. Canceling a future sale is not the same as reversing a sale that already happened. And Jim's sale happened on June 20th. The reporting makes clear that while officials took action to halt or review similar sales moving forward, Jim's already completed transaction wasn't immediately undone. That creates the cruel reality at the center of this story. The system can slow down the train after the crash, but it doesn't automatically pull you out from under it. For Jim, that means he's still facing the consequences even while officials talk about investigations, procedures, and potential improvements. For the public, that fuels the sense that the process is designed to be irreversible once it reaches a certain stage, no matter how confusing the communication was before it happened. And once a new buyer is involved, the urgency increases again because the homeowner isn't just fighting paperwork anymore. He's facing someone with a legal deed and the ability to push eviction forward. And the buyer's response pours gasoline on the fire. The buyer is identified as Alex Patron, and once Jim's story circulates, attention shifts hard. Public reaction can be intense in cases like this because people don't just see a transaction. They see a vulnerable homeowner being removed over a tiny balance. But Patron's message, as described, is blunt. He says the news coverage led to a flood of hate messages, and he responds by stating he's starting the eviction process. That's a turning point because it reframes the conflict as a direct collision between two realities. On one side, Jim sees himself as someone who was misinformed and effectively blindsided by timing. On the other side, the buyer sees himself as someone who purchased through a legal process and is now being publicly targeted. And when both sides feel wronged, the situation escalates quickly. The system tends to treat the sale as valid if the steps were followed, even if the communication to the homeowner was confusing. Officials reportedly indicate the sale appears legal, which makes the moral debate even hotter. Legal doesn't always feel right, especially when someone claims they were told they had time they didn't actually have. And now the clock is no longer about deadlines on a bill. It's about whether a man who says he has nowhere else to go will be forced out of the only home he had. And the final question hangs over all of it. If this can happen over $221, who's next?